So you'll have to bear with me here for just a second, because this is in fact an English class, and we are going to talk about the Pythagorean theorem, and those are two of my favorite things, so I'm excited. But where you are right now is that you've just finished drafting an essay. You've got all these words, you've thrown them together, and I've said repeatedly that I don't want you worried at all about kind of what it looks like. And so usually when you get to this point in your writing process, you do a couple of things. You might turn it in because time is up, right? You put it off to the last second, you finally finished it, now you're turning it in. If you are diligent, you might have maybe you read through it once, scanned it for typos, right? That's the thing that seems to be a big concern, or comma usage, things like that. Or if you are extremely diligent, you might have done this last one. You might have given it to your friend to read so that they can look at it and get a fresh set of eyes on it. But I want to suggest you do something else, which is to finally start writing. And this is admittedly a bit of hyperbole, but not that much. The drafting phase of writing is a really tiny part. If we look at the writing process as a whole, from having an idea and developing the idea, and then researching the idea and learning everything we need to know about it, then we finally get drafting, we draft, and then afterwards we have all this other work that we need to do. We've got to revise, we've got to edit, and then that's a recursive process. We edit and revise and edit and revise, and you might even end up back at drafting again. And so what I want to suggest to you is that having written so many words is not actually writing a really long essay. It's just the beginning, or it's kind of actually the middle. It's this small tiny section. I can't remember who it was who said this, but there's a famous sort of apocryphal saying that if I had had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter. And that's kind of the phase we're in now. We're wanting to make things shorter. And so this is the idea that I want to get locked into your head, that if something is easy to read, is very, very difficult to write. And a lot of work goes into making stuff simple. In fact, there's a whole field dedicated to it, and that's technical writing, right? Making things that are written so that they can't really be misunderstood. But usually when we think of making your writing better, we think of editing. And editing is very important. It's making sure that all the lines are lined up and all the tabs are tabbed right and the fonts are the same, and your M dashes are M dashes and your N dashes are N dashes and things like that, right? That's usually what we think of, but we usually skip this section, and that's revision. Revision is, to me, the most difficult and enjoyable and important part of writing, because we're taking the raw material of the text that we've produced, and now we are taking a confused mess that it was when we first thought of it, and we are revising it to the point where it is going to be linear and clear, both for us and for our audience. We are improving the soul of the text, and this is really where writing does its magic, in that you become smarter than you actually are, because your intelligence becomes unbounded by time, and you can just continually make it better. Both are a part of this long writing process, though, and it's, like I said before, recursive. You draft, you revise, you edit, and that goes on and on and on. But the first phase of revision that I'd like to suggest to you is to do outlining. And usually when we think of outlining, we think of this is a tool that helps us plan what we're going to write. I'm going to do my research, then I'm going to get my structure in my head. I'm going to do, a 5-point outline, and then I'm going to write according to that. That's what we think of. But the kind of outlining that I'm talking about will look similar, but instead of helping you plan, it's going to help you see what you've done, to visualize what you've done so that you can find out what's irrelevant. You can rearrange things by just moving them around in the outline, and then you can move those corresponding paragraphs later. It's a visual technique in much the same way that the annotated bibliography was a visual technique. You need to get your sources next to one another. You need to be able to read these summaries and these analyses right next to one another so that you can start to see those connections. The outline will do the same thing for your paper. And that brings us to the Pythagorean theorem. we'll see how this goes because I'm a little bit out of my element. So the first thing I want to do is explain the Pythagorean theorem, right? You understand that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and indulge me here. This is a stretch, but it'll make sense. And the reason that a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and this is, the two sides a and b of a right triangle can be squared, and the sum of those squares is equivalent to the square of the hypotenuse in the case that the hypotenuse is unknown. And so then you take the root of that result, and that gives you the length of the hypotenuse, which if you are, an ancient Egyptian, this is super relevant knowledge because, as it turns out, they did a lot of cool stuff with triangles. And so when you think about squaring those sides, you're taking them and it's only a single line, and then you're actually turning it into a square, and then the volume of those actually can be summed to make the volume of the other square that you would make with the hypotenuse. Now, that description is probably not super clear. It's all the right information, and if you already knew that information, if you already internalized it, then you understood it because, well, it was correct. But here's what happens when we start to visualize things, and I don't know why, more math isn't taught this way. We want to understand not just the formula a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but we want to understand the reason behind it, to go beyond something arbitrary to understand those connections and relationships. So let's start with the triangle, and we know one of the sides has a length of 3. This is a right triangle, and when we square it, what we're really doing is we're actually making that square. And we know it's a square, so all the sides are the same length. And then let's square the other side that has a length of 4. So squaring really means just actually making the square. And then if we were to take these two squares and to fill them up with little 1x1 boxes, we'd be able to fit 9 1x1 boxes in that one, and we'd be able to fit 16 1x1 boxes in that one, right? So a total of 25 1x1 boxes. So let's take the square of this. If we know according to the formula that we're supposed to be able to fit 25 1x1 boxes in this square, then we know each of the sides has to be 5, giving us the length of the hypotenuse. In other words, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Now, this is one of my favorite things to actually visualize, and you can, if you want to, you can do this with little tiny squares to actually fill up that volume. And I have this fantasy in my head that, lo these many thousands of years ago, Pythagoras and all of his followers and fellow scholars were sitting around with sticks in the dirt, drawing these shapes, trying to figure it out. And I think it's just this wonderful, cool thing that they were able to discover this relationship and then to extend that relationship into a representative formula. And it's so sad to me that the way we teach it now is just by teaching this formula, or at least I say now, I'm in my mid-30s, so the way it was taught 20 years ago, was just to sort of teach the formula and then make you use it, when the reasoning behind it shows how ingenious it is. That's what makes it interesting. Okay, so our journey is from an arbitrary rule, from just a vague formula, to something that is understanding. And this is what I want you to be looking at when you're looking at an outline that you might make, because when you make an outline, you're able to see the relationships, right? It's no longer just, I put this next because it was next. That's what I thought of next. And it's also not, it's what's next because that's based on an outline that I did first. You're looking at it and you're saying, okay, what purpose does this piece serve here? Why here? There should be a reason that it goes there. Every piece, like a brick that you're stacking, should stack on the previous one to make the structure of your paper, to make the structure of your argument. That metaphor of structure, of building something, isn't accidental. A good structure has to start from the bottom and move up. Each piece depends on the previous piece, and it can't be arbitrary. It has to be based on something reasonable, based on something real, okay? And the outline is a visual tool that helps us to see all of those relationships. Now, some of you might be saying, this is false equivalency. Pythagorean theorem and an outline, they're two different because one is math and one is, a subjective art, and that's not really how it works. And there's a degree of truth in that, because the Pythagorean theorem is perfect. It's irreducible. You can't remove any of those elements and it still be the Pythagorean theorem. And that's not the case with art, because art is reducible and it's never perfect. It can never be finalized. But you can imagine before we knew the actual formula for the Pythagorean theorem, all the extraneous information that might have been there, right? Like the sum of the interior angles of a triangle is equivalent to 180. We know that. I think, is it 360 or 180? It's got to be 180. Yeah. I think it's 180, right? That sum is 180 degrees. That's the sum of the interior angles of a triangle. But that's not relevant for the Pythagorean theorem apart from the fact that it has to be a right triangle, right? And so it doesn't appear in the formula. The units don't matter, right? It doesn't matter if it's 25 inches or 25 feet or 25 yards or cubits or miles or light years. The units are irrelevant, right? As long as it's the same unit throughout, the relationship remains the same. And so when we get rid of all the extraneous things, we have the pure formula. And that's also true for your essay. When you get rid of the extraneous things, you're going to have something much better. And so I want to show you what you can do with elimination. I think to demonstrate, hopefully, the power of revision, how much change can go into your paper without adding anything, just by taking away things that don't matter. So there's this thing called blackout poetry, where you just black out words to make poetry. So this is from an old syllabus that I wrote a couple of years ago, and this is sort of boilerplate syllabus stuff where, you know, you've got to put it in there. Nobody's going to read it. It doesn't particularly mean anything, you know, but you put it in there to make the muckety-mucks happy, who are making you submit your syllabi, right? And this is what a blackout poem might be. Writing is busy work. Acquire your own experiences and approach ideas. So simply by removing a lot of stuff, we can actually create an entirely new thing, right? This is not the same as this. And the fact that it's all been sort of so heavily redacted like this is kind of, I think, visually impressive. I like the visuals as well. But this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. It's the power of getting rid of things, right? None of these words were applied by me after the fact. It's just removing things that gets us there. Okay, so your outline can function kind of like blackout poetry, where you essentially have this series of long-winded Jeopardy rules that you need to solve. That's how I want you to think of the sections and the paragraphs in your paper. So you pull out your paper and you look at it and you read, a section, and it's, all about, this book series is, the most fantastic book series ever written, and it's a response and continuation on Tolkien, but for global interest rather than just the interests of England. And it delves deeply into extremely progressive politics for the time, about the relationship between men and women and the balance of power, and what it means to actually have sort of that balance and to pursue it. And the answer, of course, is what is the Wheel of Time, right? And so in my outline, I write, what is the Wheel of Time, in response to that sort of very loose paragraph that I just wrote. But you can do the same thing. Read a paragraph, and then what's your Jeopardy answer? What is the blank? What is the blank? Why does blank? But ask a question, and then put that next to each of the paragraphs and to each of the sections, right? So the section, if it's your literature review, where you're talking about all your sources, if it's your introduction, where you're sort of getting the idea out there, those can have a major question, and then each paragraph can have a smaller question, and the result is going to be an outline that has this identifiable structure. And then what you can do is you can start hacking away at it, right? You can move things around, you can delete sections, and see what that outline looks like. And it may be true that when you do the same thing to the actual paper, it doesn't work out, but also it might. Right? You might be able to get rid of whole sections, of whole paragraphs, and change nothing. Because a rule that we have to keep is that we want to keep only what is essential. When we have pared away all of the irrelevance, and what is essential that is left, that pure product, that is the essay that we always wanted to write.